Okay. Clicking the button. We're going live. Hooray! I think we're live. Well, welcome everyone to another lovely Wardley Mapping Conversations. Today we've got some awesome guests. We're going to talk about win-win collaboration, and I'll introduce them in just a second. But first, I just wanted to say thank you for being here. If this is your first stream, go ahead and say hi in the chat. We'll say hi back. And if you've been here before, well, thank you for always being here. This is great. I'm really excited to get into what we're going to talk about today. So, some quick things. If you ever want to stay in the know about our live streams, just head over to lwm.events. And there's always new live streams coming up in there, as well as new workshops and things like that. So keep that in mind. And with that, I'm going to introduce our lovely group today. You all are familiar with David Hall. David is my friend and companion in running these live streams. He's always holding down the fort for me. So thanks for being here, David.
Thank you.
Today we've got Sue Borchard and Mike Haber. Oh, I'm so glad that you're here. The two of you have always been like some of my favorite people to work with and make maps with and talk about things with. So maybe let's start with Sue. Sue, tell us a little bit about how you got into the Wardley mapping space and what kind of things you're involved in these days.
Well, I think I found Wardley Mapping as like a hashtag on Twitter that was sort of floating in the Kinevin, my Kinevin space on Twitter, and it crossed my radar enough times that I just Googled it and found some of Simon's keynotes, and it just the argument that Simon makes in those keynotes is just so hard to argue with. I'm like, well, you're an idiot if you're not mapping stuff to be strategic. Like, it just seems so obvious. And then because the context that I was working in is these sort of social change efforts, like I'm on the board of a nonprofit that's trying to end the use of prolonged forced solitary confinement in prisons.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it was just really a struggle for me to kind of triangulate with the idea of costs and capital and users. And so I've just had to do a lot of work to try and reframe how to use this in a context where there's not a clear user, where there's much more of these confluences of stakeholders.
Yep.
But it's been really fun. And I think the underlying theory there is just really compelling. Like the sort of evolution, the way stuff stabilizes over time. It's just the way stuff works.
I love it, yeah. And that confluence of stakeholders is such a fabulous and interesting idea, because it isn't just like a one-way thing with users. It's a mess. And so that brings us to Mike, like thinking about all the kinds of work that you've done with basically making sense of messes, right? Like you do a lot of sketch arting. Oh, both of you do sketches, which is great, actually. I forgot about that. I should have renamed this one the sketch artist episode. But Mike, tell us a little bit about your intro to Wardley Mapping. Like what brought you into this space, and why has it caught your attention?
I can't remember exactly how it caught my attention, but what I started doing a few years ago was basically trying to just study the most interesting thing for me right now, and then jumping in between topics. But I kind of stuck on systems and complexity topics, and I found Simon's blog and some of the things he wrote for the UK government, the Boiling Frogs paper and things like that.
Got it. Yeah.
And yeah, as Sue said, there's so many. When Simon talks, have a picture, point at it, talk about the picture.
Yep.
That just seems so obvious, and it's such a powerful tool. It's so simple that you can't really not use it. And I'm kind of good at repurposing things in ways that they might not have been initially thought of being used for, which is why the Wardley Mapping for Good, it's very OODA, it's very militaristic, it's very strategy, it's very winner takes all. So obviously my brain goes, nah.
Yeah. Yep. Excellent. So that's, man, what these are fabulous stories. And one of the things I've been trying to do is kind of counter that narrative of like, you've got to take a competitive, like winner take all kind of framing of things, and also like honestly the part of this where it's like, if you're not doing this, you don't know what you're doing, which I think that raises the bar, like, because it's really like it makes it really really hard to get into it. I guess I should say like the actual getting started bit is really hard for people, and so when you say like you're an idiot if you don't do this, it's like okay, but it's hard, so like you gotta get started. So I think like when we have folks like you, Sue and Mike, helping us kind of explore what it's like to use this very competitive, very militaristic kind of framework in a non-competitive win-win sense, like I get really excited. Like this is, not only are we going to show people what it's like to do it, which means we're going to kind of deal with that jump of like trying to get started and trying to get into it, but we're also going to use it in a way that maybe like people aren't thinking about using it. So we're going to pave some new ground here, which brings us, I think, to the Miro board. So there are two sketches
That's okay.
here.
I've already started jamming stuff on there, Ben. So
All right, yeah. Tell me what you
hopefully
got
I'm
in
not
here.
messing you up.
Cool.
Not at all. What have you got so far?
I don't want to interrupt you. Where were you going to go, Ben?
I was just going to talk about some of the pictures that are in here. Like, so you've got some sketches, and Mike's got some sketches. Let's talk about the sketches.
Yeah.
So I see, Sue, you've got the strategy cycle. Could you tell us, like, what's your envisioning of Simon's strategy cycle? What's it like?
Well, I guess the reason I feel like it's important to bring in is because it's not represented on the map. And I heard this fun little podcast about the Stoics and how it was really about doing what you can with what you have in the situation that you're in. But that's not enough. You can do a lot of evil with just that as the only heuristic. So like, where's the doctrine? Where are the principles and the values that inform the moves that you're willing to make?
Yeah.
So that's why I brought it onto the board. I just wanted to get that in the space, in the headspace.
No, that's really excellent. Like, we've got maps, right? Like, maps are descriptions of a situation. They talk about, basically they give you the language for the mess, and from that you can define technical problems or social problems, things like that, like issues of strategy. But like, the map is not the process. It's not the unfolding of doing the work, doing the thinking, making the models, like thinking about how the forces of capitalism are like doing stuff to that situation, thinking about what we ought to be doing, how we ought to constrain our actions in certain ways, while also recognizing power and acknowledging that like we're constraining ourselves, and we're not going to do certain things, but that makes us vulnerable in certain ways. Like, those kinds of conversations are hard, and the map does not like show you how to have them. So excellent. So we've got that strategy cycle in here. Mike, if I could ask you to tell us a little bit about this image off to the left, like, it started out with like the title of "Doing Good with Wardley Maps," right? So how did we get from Simon's competitive approach to how can we do good with Wardley Maps? How can we do win-wins? Can you tell us a little bit of the story there?
I guess it depends on doing good according to who, because most Wardley Maps are anchored around user needs, and you do tend to have user needs are based in your values. Wardley Maps is the competitive value, and it's we need to make money, which as it's a context appropriate method. But sometimes you might have it be in a different context, and you might want to do something other than that.
Yeah. Yep.
And I still think the Wardley mapping framework and the Wardley mapping canvas by some guy called Ben, just go through what he needs, what's this, is an appropriate way to approach things. But your needs to collaborate aren't necessarily do good according to who. Your needs to collaborate can be other people may collaborate on doing things that you don't agree with.
Yeah, Mike, I really read that was like the thing that came into my head this morning as I was pondering all this was that good is so hyper local in a sense, and also role based and so many things, and so I was thinking about when you do have all these stakeholders, how do you check what other people need, and if get consent from people en masse, like is this something that will help, and who am I to decide?
So, like Simon says, his maps democratize strategy, make strategy available to everyone. And then it seems like he thinks it's a really fun game to sit back and, watch the best strategist win. In the same way, if you work out ways to help people to collaborate, they may collaborate on stuff that you'd rather they didn't.
Yes.
But you help everyone, so that's where I come from. It's not just there's not a list of, although the types of doing good I've put on the right hand side, working on environmental issues, health issues, democracy, society issues, and collaboration. People could collaborate to break out of jail. They could collaborate to bribe politicians. Who knows? But I think one of the key things is that if you teach people how collaboration works and how it's based in values, you can see where people are coming from then. It democratizes the whole. If you democratize the tool set like Simon has,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Well, so you can reframe. When you said, if I remember correctly, you need to align with values on someone, with people, and decide what we're going to do. That's a user need. I think we can map. What do you need to do what do you need to do to check your values with someone?
So I'm actually talking about aligning values. That's a really great point. I'm actually talking about knowing what my values are and what constrain my actions. I mean, I could try and end solitary confinement by enforcing it legally, like get some legislation passed, lobby.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I find often the language vilifies correctional officers, wardens, secretaries of corrections. It's like, oh, well, we have to have some enemy that we're fighting against, or else this wouldn't work. And so in my frame, I love the thing that you said about help everyone, because that is sort of a value I think that guides me a little bit, which is like, there can be no villains in this story, or else I'm not working for peace.
Okay. I struggle with that one so much because on the one hand, like, vilification is almost central to being the rallying cry for certain kinds of movements. Like, it's easier to be against something sometimes than for something. And like I was making a map of, for example, policing, and I was thinking, and I think I actually have this here. Like, I want to do a deeper dive on this on a stream sometime, because like honestly, I don't know what I'm, I don't have any subject matter expertise, right? I'm just like doing what I can to understand based on what I've seen, and so it'd be really fascinating to get someone with some actual expertise on there. But like, it's so funny, like the moves, like, so off to the left here is the map that I made, right? The moves, like defunding police, for example, comes attached with like the vilification part of that. But like, when I just made the map of it, I'm like, no, we have a system that's producing murder. And there are so many other like policies, like there's funding is one angle, qualified immunity is another angle, how we do arming and how we do training is another angle. But like the workload, like the fact that we have dependence on like mental health response is an activity that needs to happen. But right now the workload is on police. And so it's like, when you start to get down to the the details like this, it's like, well, yeah, defunding because we're going to shift off this workload. Like defunding because, frankly, policing as an institution for mental health response and for investigation and auto safety is like seems to be in a lot of places a corrupt institution, and so like maybe there's a conversation there.
Yeah.
Destruction then recreation. I don't know.
The thing that I've been thinking a lot about. So the latest little thing that got lobbed into my head was these frames of power.
Mm-hmm.
From I heard it from this gal Hari Hahn. She's a political scientist at Johns Hopkins Agora Institute, and it comes from a guy named Stephen Lukes, and it's the visible face of power, the hidden face of power, and the invisible face of power. So the visible face of power is the cops, right? They're the people with the uniform. The hidden face of power you might think of as the Fraternal Order of Police. They're the union. They're the people who are controlling the agenda, but they're not necessarily in a positional authority. And then the invisible face of power is what Luke calls these like the assumptions and beliefs that each one of us hold that's keeping the other two voices of power in place. Like people need to be punished or chaos will reign. Or if we don't have a well-funded police department, then we will fall to our basest instincts and there'll be crime will run rampant. Like these are the invisible face of power that are really hard to surface. And so I just wonder about Wardley mapping for things like that, like the visible, because the visible is in play as well, the visible, hidden, and invisible faces of power. And then I've also been thinking about them, like you all, I think, have heard of Mary Parker Follett's power with, power over, power to frame.
Yeah, Kat's been talking about that.
So Mary Parker Follett only had the first two, power over and power with, but Hari Hahn brought it into the conversation is that citizenship is a form of power with. It's saying, I am going to commit some of my resources to you, to us, to the benefit of the good, the commons. And that is something that needs to be learned, that we don't necessarily have these power with skills. So it started making me think about like, where are our power with relationships, and could we map those on a Wardley map as well? Because the more stable those are, the more trusting they are, or maybe the more trusting they are, the more power with we're okay with. I don't know.
So I'm trying to just catch up with the notes here. Like, so Mary Parker Follett, power with, power over, and then Hari Hahn on the right.
Hari Hahn.
And what was the third one? Power.
There's power two. That
power
came
two,
on more recently. I think about that in terms of like Mike's collaborative skills. Like, a lot of us weren't taught how to collaborate. I had to learn it. I was trained as an engineer and I wasn't taught to collaborate, which is a crime. But it's a skill, right? And so like anything, to have power to collaborate, I think is sort of underlying power with. I don't know. I'm going to let you get a word in edgewise here, Mike.
Well, it's a user need. And you're right that generally when we map something, look at Simon's IT Wardley maps, we know how to do the bits. It says do X, and you have an idea how to do that, right? We know how to do it. But if our Wardley map said develop trust, we don't have. Okay, how do I do that? It's complex.
Yeah.
But we can break it down and say, well, where has that worked? How did they do it? What did they do? So rather than mapping what we're doing, we're mapping our intentions and what we'd like to have happen. And it's not a map of how we're doing stuff. It's going, well, how might we develop trust? How has it helped in the past?
Interesting. Yeah. See, I'd argue with that, Mike. I feel like we got to go from where we are, and we might not even know the ways that we're undermining trust. So I've gotten a little obsessed with trust models lately too.
Ooh, tell us about it.
But I don't want to interrupt, Mike. I'm going to go off in the background if it's okay, and I want to hear more about what you have to say about Mark. But can I embed a Kumu map on the Miro board?
Probably.
Okay. I mean, no, I know it's possible. I just wanted to ask permission.
I mean, knock yourself out.
Okay. What do you think about that challenge I just gave you, Mike? I just pushed back on that idea. So I want to
Well,
hear.
I guess trust is only one of the things that might be a problem. And yeah, you're right. We shouldn't be upfront designing what we need to do, but we can start from what works. There's a great example of Wikipedia of being a complex adaptive system where people work together. They've got some shared values. They don't agree with each other, but I think Sam Obergia recently said it's one of the last publishing institutions that people still trust. That hasn't burnt off its credibility. So you can look at how did they do that? What are they doing?
I don't know, though. I mean, to me, that's a very particular context, and I don't know that it's necessarily translatable.
No, it's all context appropriate, I guess, and that's the problem, is that there are so many different ways people may want to collaborate. I don't think we're looking at drawing a map. I think there are many maps for many contexts, and mapping to me feels quite a long way off.
Well, so I find myself having to map our challenge at the nonprofit that I work for all the time, or I'm on the board. I don't actually work for it. But so I do map, but what I'm struggling with, so Hari Han says you have a power problem when the people who need to act are not the people with the authority to act. And so I think about us here on the outside, us meaning the board of Interfaith Action, and how our leverage points we've chosen as being legislators and lobbyists. But there are other possible leverage points. And in fact, the ground zero leverage point is the correctional officer. So I can still map that, but until I'm in dialogue with, like, a lot of times solitary is used because it is the tool that you have when you as a correctional officer feel like your life is in danger. If there's someone who has more power than you or more strength than you, you're like, some minor infraction, you're like, you blow it out of proportion, you put them in administrative segregation. And so you need to partner with those people. I mean, if you're genuinely, that, as you point out, Mike, user needs are a really good guide for this. As a correctional officer, you have a need, and that is to be safe, which is one of the pillars of trust. I mean, like there's this warped web. Well, I don't even know if it's warped. It just gets warped when we don't make it visible.
Yeah, it's a mess. It's and there are all sorts of user needs, and I need to refer back to the drawing I did, but whatever it is you're doing, people will not want you to do it. The closer you get to your goal of ending. Do you
think that's true? I think they only want you to do it if you try and exert power over them.
Well, there may be people who think that solitary confinement is fine and appropriate and we should use more of it, for example.
Well, there may be, but that doesn't mean that in partnering with them and dialoguing with them that you can't shift that. I mean, I've seen it happen. I've seen, like, secretaries of correction in Colorado, they had a situation where somebody got released directly from prison. They were in solitary when they were in prison. So they basically got directly released from solitary to the outside, went directly to the Secretary of Corrections' home and shot him and killed him. And so then there was this, like, whoa, maybe the United Nations is right. Maybe we are actually making people more mentally ill by locking them up and isolating them. Like, and so that the head of corrections, the follow-on from the guy that was murdered, his successor put himself in solitary. He experienced it himself and has completely changed the way. And I know I did use the word forced isolation because it's about choice. I have talked to plenty of people in jails, in prisons, who have said, I want that option. If I'm going to knock somebody's block off, let me self-isolate and let me decide when I come out. So it's not that it's always bad.
So there are occasions when what we want to have happen has happened. People have changed their minds. And if we're looking at strategies to do that again, would it be useful to map how that happened in that context, how they did it, so that we have an option of strategies to use?
See, I'm curious about the tension that I'm hearing between our approaches is that you want to use the cases of what's worked and learn from it, which I think is great. And that's already happening in corrections. They get all the wardens, they get together and learn from that. I tend to think more about, like, I'm not a warden. So given where I am on the landscape, it's better for me and to map where I am in relationship to the people that I have connections with. So more like it doesn't help me to imagine a mapping scenario that I'm not in. I really struggle with that.
Of course, yeah, and I'm probably talking from my context, and it doesn't fit yours.
So tell me more about your context, because maybe we could pick one of those and dig into it instead of the one I'm prattling on about.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got one to hand right now. My brain works in interesting ways.
And we love you for it. So,
isn't it?
What I'll say with this is, I've seen the creation of artifacts be helpful just to basically create a stage for negotiation about what we think the situation is. And I've also seen it useful to talk about it from a theoretical standpoint. How would we go about engaging with a situation like this? So there's like the problem itself. Let's map it out of whatever situation we're in. Let's figure it out. And then there's, what are the mechanisms for figuring out problems like this? And so there's like a more theoretical angle there, but it can help you say, oh, we could use these tools in these situations. So like, Sue, let's start with like, okay, yeah, you've got your Kumu map. Let's actually like do some mapping, and I kind of want to see how win-win interactions emerge from those situations. Like how do you start somewhere that's a mess, and how do you, like, Sue, I imagine you have a process for this, right? And I notice like it's very clear like you've done a lot of work around this kind of thing.
Well, one thing I'm thinking about is if we could map, well, one of my go-to tools is the Innovator's Compass. Mm-hmm. And the way that I use it is it could help, I think, with where we are. So for instance, I'm going to just draw one right down here.
Awesome.
In the conversation, we have Mike, Ben, and Sue. And we have people on the chat, which I confess I haven't been monitoring because I'm in so deep in thought. So we have some things that we have noticed. Like, Mike, you named, well, I named the Colorado case as a success, as an example. And this is the way this compass works is bottom left is past and present details. So it's like a 2x2 with people in the center. And then big picture is the top and the right is future. So Mike, if you were to say like, what's the thing we can envision on some of your maps? Like we could envision a more circular waste stream and production for a problem like addressing climate change. We could also imagine prisons as healing institutions, places where we release people better than when we put them in. So this is where you put sort of the pie in the sky up here in the top right. And then the bottom left is where you put observations.
Oh, I'm already thinking like, as a first step, you could do something like this and then decide which kind of map to make.
Right. Well, so what I have done is I think about Wardley mapping as going down here. Or sorry, I made way too many lines. Wardley mapping down here, like the evolution, although I sometimes have to flip it around because I think of the things that are over here as the oldest. And so they've been around longest. And this is the future. So this is the thing we're going to try, which is sort of the left hand of a Wardley map. if that makes any sense. And then I think up here are the things from that strategy cycle. The values are here. Down here at the bottom. And so we can bring in the values that were on the sort of Simon's definition of strategy. And then when we have ACT here, that's really down here, because this is the things that you can do now. What can you do now? What's a move you can make? And so I think we could totally map what we have observed down here in a Wardley map on a particular challenge that we want to make progress on up here, the sort of cloud pie in the sky kind of stuff. So you can see I like mash up a bunch of frames. I mean, if you're a Cynefin person, you can also think of this as where you do your parallel safe to fail experiments.
Nice.
Yeah, because what worked in the past, isn't going to work in the future, but it might rhyme, if you like.
It might rhyme. I like it.
The one thing that kind of breaks this a little bit for me, this is absolutely fabulous, right? Because you're making specific kinds of moves, and it seems like these are the moves around like what you can do now, what you can make sense of now, what you can yes, there's the big pie in the sky, like ideal futures. One of the things that kind of like makes this a little messy for me too is like time spans. So like in a weird way, like I think of big picture kind of ideas as like long time span ideas, like 10, 20, 100 years. And I haven't quite figured this out, but Jabe Bloom, for example, seems pretty sure that you can have like components with different time spans on a map. So like you have a very tightly like detailed map that has like time, like components of a time span of like 2 weeks to several months to maybe a year or whatever, compared to like 10-year components. And I haven't quite figured that part out. I'm gonna have to ask him. I think we're doing a stream next Monday with him. But like I almost want to like crack that problem now and think like how can you do big time span like past or present maps? How can you do small time span maps, like very detailed maps, and then connect them to big long time span maps? Because like I think the details version of this is like pretty familiar. Like people who are doing work now in the present will like know what those moving parts are. But I don't know. Zooming out is also interesting, and I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think I've been kind of doing the 2-week time span and less stuff with I forget the name. I'll look it up and paste it on the board. But with a map Teresa Torres developed for product management. I'll share it in just a minute. But it just kind of like, you can take some of the bigger picture time spans off of the Wardley map and kind of look at like what direction we want to go. I mean, that's the context I've been using it for. And then breaking it down to goals and then user needs again underneath of that kind of goal you're heading towards, and then experiments kind of nested at the bottom. So you kind of like build back up, like, did this experiment solve that need, and did that need solve the goal we're heading for?
Oh, nice. And Rob White in the chat mentioned Wardley mapping, and Mike, you mentioned Samo Borja earlier as well. And like for analyzing power dynamics, one of the things I'll usually do too with the when I'm making a map or when I'm entering a new circumstance in general, like I want to understand who the players are. Because yes, Wardley mapping like prioritizes like stakeholders, users at the top, but I kind of need to understand like the full social dimension more directly. Sue, have you ever seen Wardley mapping at all? Have you ever played with that?
A long time ago, I think he posted something on Twitter, and I think I looked at something that Tashin had done on it, but I didn't dig into it.
Yeah, and this is the product thing, David. Just is that what that was? Got it. Oh, right. Yeah, I think I've seen this.
Yeah, just putting the link in there.
Sweet. And then, yeah, and I'll throw this into chat as well, just for anyone who needs that. And then Borea mapping, like down below, like kind of like, so Tashin has talked about this one, but it's about like analysis of power class based on Samo's like empire theory kind of thing. And I've done this a couple different ways, but basically you have in empire theory, it's like a basic idea that like the world is made of empires. You have central powers that are high in each empire. So like in a prison, for example, the central power might be the warden, if you will. Whereas you might also like, so that's high. And then there's like mid and low. And the basic idea is that mid can challenge high's power. And then there's low. Low can challenge mid, but not high. And so it's very like focused on whose will gets asserted, I think. And then there's out. And these are people who don't coordinate around high. And so this like, you can start analyzing alliances between different players and things like that. So like if you've got your warden, like you could have folks in prison who, you know, are aligned with the warden or who can challenge the warden, right?
Yeah, in Baltimore City, we actually had the detention center was run by I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Gorilla Family. They were like a big organized crime group, and they ran the prison. Like they would get lobster and crab cakes and champagne delivered. Like they got like multiple female correctional officers pregnant. So it's like they just had this like so yes, the power thing can be challenged even from someone who's not in any kind of official capacity.
And then you have like out, so like folks, lawyers, for example, like representation and things like that. They don't get to tell the warden what to do, right? They don't get to assert control, but what they can do is bring in other empires into the picture. Like, for example, you can do social movements. You can bring in oversight of certain kinds, and then that, like, the oversight might challenge high because they're just a bigger, assuming the accountability mechanisms are there. Like, but this is a way of like talking about those players and so on. And,
yeah.
And Alan mentions too, like this isn't it. Like there's more to this theory. There's like liveness and deadness of the players. Like, are they willing to learn or able to learn new things, or are they stuck in patterns? There's all sorts of stuff there.
Yeah, I had done a similar take on like lawyers, family members, commanders, wardens. I just put it right next to yours because I was sort of trying to put the chain of people that were at that nexus.
Oh, got it. So I'd probably put wardens down towards mid, and commanders or COs towards high. Maybe
right.
Instead. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mine was starting from the user as a person who's incarcerated. So I was sort of going Wardley map direction.
Yeah.
But it's confusing because then the governor is at the bottom, but the governor is kind of the most visible. So it doesn't quite, I think that's the challenge in terms of the nexus like of stakeholders is like, how do you, I mean, if you mapped all those different stakeholders, I just wonder if it wouldn't reveal some power moves in terms of moves that actually have benefit or interest from multiple stakeholders. I mean, I feel like I'm in politics 101, like that's not my field, but other people who are political are probably like, duh. Like, that's like community organizing lady. But that's just not my wheelhouse. I come more from a psychology background.
So I'd like to kind of get a little bit into the Wardley mapping side of this and dig into kind of the two approaches that each of you described. And so I thought maybe what we could do is we could just dig into, like, Sue, your work. Maybe we'll start with the work that you've done around ending solitary confinement, and kind of maybe tell the story of the work that's been happening in these communities. And like what I can do is map along.
That would be great.
So can you find me over here at the little Wardley mapping template thing?
Yeah, I'm right with you.
Awesome. Okay. So yeah, you're right on that there's this like kind of problem where representing multiple stakeholders or users in a Wardley map is a little bit messy. And in general, like all these problems, any problem, any situation, the closer that you look, the more moving parts you'll see. And so like the fractality of this is like can be really overwhelming. And so I like to just sort of take off little chunks at a time and start small. And so start with like one small aspect of the problem and make multiple maps and then eventually start to see patterns. So like let's start small. So yeah, legislation was one of the things that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I just added another one, which has been it turned out accidentally to be a big part of our work, but getting information on the use of solitary.
Oh yeah.
We've got two things that seem to work to get that. One was pen pals, and these aren't pen pals like I'm going to write you a letter and be your friend. This is I'm going to write you because I know you're in solitary and I've been introduced to you, and would you be willing to give me information?
Yeah. Whoa.
And that was, we have a gal who's done that, and she writes to tens of people in the Virginia system now, Virginia prison system, to get a read on what's happening. And it's actually it's illuminated a bunch of new user needs, which is we're trying to end the use of attack dogs now in Virginia, because Virginia is one of the only states in the union that still uses attack dogs on prisoners. It's barbaric. The second thing would be legislating reporting laws. So I'm going to put this under legislation, or maybe it goes above legislation. I don't really know, but I'll just spew for the time being. Reporting legislation is another way to get information. So so the capabilities was a big relationship building push. The reporting legislation capability, that took years to get past.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
and it's state by state. We only work in 2 states and the district. And so those are 2. Another challenge is this sort of gamification of it. So changing the name of solitary. So we're like chasing our tails because we call it solitary confinement, but in Maryland, you're not really isolated alone. You're isolated with one other person often. And so then they call it restrictive housing or administrative segregation. And so even if you get legislation passed, then there's a technicality that's like, well, we'll just change the name of it, and then we're not using solitary anymore.
That is messed up.
I know. So this is another reason why you can't be really like stick your finger in the dike and solve the problem with these. You really have to look at the ecosystem, which is why I think that Wardley mapping could be really useful in this space.
Okay.
And it sounds like if some of those things take longer than others, then you can choose. They're your strategies. Is our strategy a legislative strategy, in which case it might take years? Or is a strategy are there other strategies that, changing public opinion and demonstrations that might take much less time? And, whose user needs are being met, by having attack dogs?
Right. So
can you meet those user needs in another way? And is that a way of, and if you understand these, and if Wardley mapping is a great way to get your assumptions out on paper and to point at them and have them challenged.
Yeah. So Mike, based on what you just said, I also added judiciary approaches, because with the attack dog scenario, we're actually suing the state of Virginia. So a different approach, because it seems more like we've got to come at it more aggressively.
Yeah. And this is we've gone back to the competition thing and OODA. You observe what's happening, orient, decide what to do and act, and then you go and observe if it's working or not. Is that the appropriate way to do it? And can you run these things in safe to fail parallel experiments.
Yeah. So
What do you have the firepower to run? Do you have enough people to, run different sorts of campaigns?
that's something that I think about with this. Like, so from the collaboration standpoint, like there's a mess, and it's doing things that we don't like, right? And we want to think that there are better options available, and so we're defining the problem together so we can all look at it, and then which things should we do? Well, yeah, how much capacity do we have? Are different groups with different interests more likely to work on different aspects of this problem than others? Like maybe like a lawyer is better for the the judiciary or legislative approach, right? Because they can work with those kinds of things. They have the skills to do those kinds of things. Whereas like a volunteer can be a pen pal. And the phrase like by all possible means comes to mind, and like safe to fail experimentation is all about like running those things in parallel to see whether we get more of what we want or less of what we want. So could you say a little bit more about safe to fail experimentation, Mike? Just to sort of like, how does it work? Like how does a map fit into that, and like all that kind of stuff?
My word. Okay, so
It's small task.
yeah, let's see if I can do it. So a safe to fail experiment has to be something you can do. It has to have an outcome that you can measure to see whether it's working or not, and then you can choose whether to do more or less of it. Safe to fail, I guess, means that I'm not entirely sure what the definition of that is, but it's not something that's going to, on its own, break your problem or make it intractable in some way. It's not dropping a bomb, which is irreversible. But it has to be something that you can measure, because you then in the future decide whether you're going to do more or less of it with the resources you have.
I've seen pre-planning mechanisms for, at least the way I've heard Dave Snowden describe it, like pre-planning mechanisms for amplifying it if it's going well. Like if you've got those measurements in play. Oh, it seems like writing notes with pen pals is a way. It's getting us information.
Yeah.
So we're going to amplify that by taking these steps that we've predetermined. But I guess the thing that makes it safe for the failure to occur is like, oh, it's not working and there's a backlash, and we have pre-planned mechanisms for dampening it, for dealing with that. And that just taking that moment before you jump into the experiment to decide what those mechanisms are, that seems like the important part too.
So I visited a jail in New Hampshire that was run by a super progressive warden, and I loved it. He gave me carte blanche. I had the run of the place for days. I could just go anywhere I wanted and talk to people, and with an escort. And I heard from people how he invented a lot of the same practices that we hear, like from Dave Snowden, like safe to fail and ritualized dissent, just over his 30 years. So if he proposed that they not handcuff people when they're getting booked. And the booking officer was like, you're out of your mind. I am not going to sit in front of somebody with my face in my paperwork unhandcuffed. And they basically have these sessions. Anytime there's a proposed change like that, they have sessions where everyone talks about everything that could possibly go wrong, ritualized dissent. And then they craft an experiment that they think is safe to fail. And he had a little added thing, which was, if we decide as a group to go through with it, no bitching for the duration of the experiment. Like, you can report on stuff that's gone wrong. Like if you get cold cocked, yes, we want to know about that. But you can't be like, this is a stupid idea, we shouldn't be trying this, I'm against it. Nope, you had your, like, you sign in, you commit, or you sign on to that experiment.
Oh, wow, interesting. So yeah, it seems like the process is strong there.
So I know I'm complicating your map, Ben,
No, by all
but
means.
I'm also putting COs up here as users, because this need for safety is often a driver for either it's a need of either the COs or vulnerable populations. They'll use solitary to protect a vulnerable incarcerated person. So the safety is sort of a one of the pipelines into solitary.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. The thing I'm like just noticing here, and I want to like point at it just for a moment, is that we're making sense of a mess as outsiders for the most part, right? Like we're not imprisoned. You know, we're also not COs or wardens, what have you. And so there's like a danger here too that like our model will be wrong and that we'll take action based on it that's wrong. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is, okay, from the outside looking in, it's like we're very glibly making a map of a very, you know, dangerous, difficult, painful, like harm-causing system. How would you, from the standpoint of, you know, map making or defining the problem or finding win-wins and things like that, how do you make that danger less? Like, how do you actually dampen that danger of us going off, you know, as people unaffected by the situation largely?
Yeah. And it's part of the reason why I went and spent a couple of days in New Hampshire in a jail. Yeah. And I also have created some relationships with a local organization. They're actually international organization called Law Enforcement Action Partnership. So it's retired correctional officers, leaders, police officers, state police, and even attorneys general that have sort of had a mind shift about sort of mass incarceration and how like the war on drugs didn't work. And so they have this more progressive, like, how do we make a better system orientation, but they come from the inside. So they're more respected and they have this wealth of experience. So for me, what I tend to do is try and get more perspectives in my wheelhouse. And I've interviewed people who have spent lots of time in solitary themselves. And that's actually where I found most of the surprises. Like when I said I spent a weekend in Patuxent in Maryland in the prison, and we had just this, it's called Alternatives to Violence. We had maybe 20 of us in a room over the weekend, about half and half, people from the outside and people from the inside. And you're supposed to pick a contentious topic and sort of hash it out one-on-one in a line, like right facing each other in chairs. And they want to pick one that you're pretty evenly split on. And one of them was, should prisons be abolished? And all the white liberal folks, the Quakers, you know, we raise our hand, and like 90% of the incarcerated men said no. And I grabbed one of them later and I'm like, tell me, what was that about? Like, why were we so imbalanced on that? And a lot of them said this was the best wake up I ever had. Like, I needed this opportunity to get away from the trajectory that I was on. And so it really did cause me to be like, yeah, you cannot assume you know what the path is here and what people want and what would be the best approach. It was shocking. And I've heard that about solitary too. People said, you know, it wasn't great, but I preferred it over being in general population. I was like, shit, like, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So
that's why I've honed in on the word forced.
Oh, okay. So that oftentimes when we're mapping, we play a lot of semantic games. Like we're using words, and oftentimes using words that have too many potential meanings, right? Like, so we kind of create a bucket and everybody reads into their own interpretation of those words and things like that. So when we start to have like a really, really defined description, like, oh, it turns out there are two needs that, well, needs. So weird, like using this language, right? Like, solitary produces safety, at least in the model, right? Solitary produces coercion, right? Or I guess is a way of control in another frame. But like, you can't, if you just rip it out of that value chain and just destroy it, like destroy the value chain in that sense, like it actually could have a negative backfiring effect too. So it's really being really particular with those words makes it really targeted and accurate, or not accurate, I should say, but specific. Like, we're talking about forced solitary confinement. How does that change the definition of the value chain if it's forced?
Mm.
So, Mike, thinking about like what we've been doing so far, just like we haven't gotten through a whole map, and that's okay because these things take a long time to get through sometimes. But from your perspective, like, does this contrast with the approach that you were advocating for when it comes to finding like collaboration and win-win opportunities?
It seems to be they seem to work together. I mean, it sounds like what Sue was doing, going into prisons and talking to people and saying, "How did you do this?" When it turns out the guy had invented the things that Dave's worked on, ritual descent and things like that. You could, communities are coming up with, here's how you run that. Here's how you do that at scale. Here's how you can take that as an element, do it somewhere else. And he might not have realised that. How do you do it? He might have gone, I don't know. But you've gone in and you've said, well, I think what you might be doing is this, 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 and this. That might work. And you can take that and put it somewhere else and say, well, that might work here. Maybe something else, maybe it won't. It's a different context, of course it won't, but there could be a set of tools you could choose from.
Yeah, I can't help going back to relationship, because it's not like the tool is the thing that gets passed. It gets passed by a person who has credibility, and so like Rick is retired now, the warden, and he does travel all over the place, and he's part of that law enforcement action partnership, which is how I got introduced to him. And so coming from him, he tries to spread these practices now. Coming from me, it wouldn't mean anything. I'm like, who are you? You don't know my job as a CO or a warden. So it's interesting. This is one of the reasons why I would be really intrigued sometime to map relationship or roles, because the stability of those roles says something about trust or coercion or all kinds of things. Because even coercive relationships can be highly stable, right? Yeah. Abuser, abusee.
Yeah, there's a lot of like underexplored kind of edges here. I think like maturity mapping and the conversation we had with skills liquidity starts to like push against some of those edges. And this is a similar kind of related, it rhymes a little bit, where we're trying, like I've seen on Simon's map of mapping, for example, like he has his own needs at the top, right? But in order to fulfill his own needs, he's fulfilling other people's needs, namely organizations, or people who need to be able to think about strategy for themselves without consultants, for example. And I think like you could very reasonably do something similar in a structure like this, where ultimately I think like the design of any system here should be, oriented around the people who are at the most risk of harm here. And so the CO's needs, yes, they exist and they're real, but like they need to be entangled in a system that's producing or reducing harm, I should say, and producing something better than harm, some kind of benefit for the people the system is here to serve, like namely the imprisoned. And it's really tough to articulate that, because all you have are like these little phrases that we bandy about, right? Like do this or do that, and then everyone attaches their meanings to it. I think it'd be interesting to dig into a full map and like a full cycle of exploration around this. Like maybe we should pick a problem and come back to this on another day, and actually like dig into a problem together and see what it's like to do that, and where the pitfalls are, and where the dangers are, and also what the benefits are, right, of doing this work together. And in particular, like I've been kind of curious, like who I could talk to about like talking about policing in particular, but we could do some mapping too around the solitary confinement things, and Sue, you know a lot about it. But
I think policing would be easier to get people in our community in the conversation. I'm thinking about, there's a couple folks that we know on Twitter that are in policing that might be game for that.
If I haven't said too many things that have pissed them off.
There's that guy that's in Chicago, Lou
Hayes, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll see what Lou thinks about that. Lou thinks about me.
I actually know in Baltimore, a retired Baltimore detective who's one of my fellow Quakers. She's a Quaker African-American retired detective. I could see if Debbie would be up for it. I don't know. She's a very busy woman though.
Yeah.
But I'd be game for that, Ben.
Oh, okay. Barbara's saying Lou Holt. Maybe I got some names confirmed here. Or names confused. Yeah, I mean... Oh, okay, Lou Hayes. Yeah, so there is one thing just on my mind with all this. Like, I want to be really, really careful not to be, like, glib as we're working through this stuff. And so I think one of the things we could do is add perspectives that, you know, have seen things, have been affected by things, to sort of bring the appropriate, like, kind of seriousness, I think, in this exploration. Because one of the things I'm worried about as, like, someone who's doing a lot of content creation around this stuff too is just like, oh, I'll just, like, kind of trample all over a problem space, you know, for the sake of the example, or, you know, anything like that. And I want to be very careful and conscious about that. So I'm not sure how to do that well, and so I'm sure folks here in the chat who are watching will have ideas and have thoughts on that. So please, I'm interested in hearing how people think about this kind of thing. So
I shared a relevant video on the board and in the chat from a friend of mine, Ariba, who talks about maybe not 100% exactly what you're asking, but it overlaps pretty largely. So I think everyone might find that interesting, but you as well.
Awesome. So just to wrap things up here a little bit, you can follow these folks on Twitter. I think they've got links in the description for this video. Let's kind of do a quick checkout. Start with you, Mike. What are your kind of thoughts coming out of this discussion about mapping for collaboration, mapping for win-win? Like, what do you wish we could pursue? Any final thoughts before we kind of leave here from you?
Well, my final thoughts are, I think at the moment that you can't...
Oh, we lost your volume here.
I'm back now.
There we go.
I think you have to do it. You have to be involved. You have to be in it yourself. You can't map things you don't know about. So doing good for other people, you know, because you think they need doing good for them is no good. You know, the rescuing type doing good. So I think a greater focus on, you know, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? You know, because if you're not involved, you're mapping something you don't know.
Yeah, it's almost like performative involvement or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, I've done this for you, and someone said, "Well, I didn't want that doing."
Yeah, nobody wants to be like the rescuer thing.
Exactly, yeah. And so there's that do-goody thing. We need to get rid of that. This is for us.
Yeah, and then so Sue, you've actually gotten into these situations, so you've seen that firsthand, like how to get involved and how to. I hesitate to use the phrase "skin in the game," but like I'm afraid someone's.
It doesn't feel like I do when I sit in the comfort of my condo, so I wouldn't go that far. But I'm invested, and mentally, emotionally, in doing what I can with what I have in the situation I'm in to at least not make things worse. Like, I'm at least want to give my attention to what's happening. And I agree on the not helping. I mean, Ed Schein wrote a whole book on it. I have it on my bookshelf called Helping.
Me too.
Don't do it. Like, you gotta have consent. But I can't help wondering about being, like, I love what you said, Mike, about being in it and situated. And I can't help thinking, like, when we get ourselves together, if there isn't some other way of approaching this, which is rather than starting with the user need and working towards the value chain, starting with our observations and pulls and energies and looking for the places that reveal new users who might reap value. Who, I don't know if am I making any sense with that?
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
going to
think
think
so.
on that. Yeah.
Well, it makes a lot of sense.
We're going from the back, going backwards. Like, what is already stable? What do we know how to do? And like working our way up to new values we could just push out and see if it sticks. See if people do think it's useful or helpful.
Like, I feel like a lot of the approaches David has used in a design context is based entirely around those kinds of.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think a lot of these challenges, I won't call them problems, but exist with design thinking and who gets invited, and even the idea of invitation describes a power structure. So yeah, lots of really interesting stuff to consider.
So Sue, any final thoughts? Any checkouts? You have a Patreon, don't you?
I do. I'm easy to find. My my website is just my first and last name, SueWarcher.com. I can paste that in the chat, and links to my Patreon are there as well. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, because both of you do kind of this fabulous kind of sketching and creation of visual representations of messy problems and things like that. So follow these folks on Twitter. I highly recommend it. You won't regret it at all. It's always very interesting and helpful to see these perspectives and to think about using mapping and other techniques. Sue's got some interesting things around post-transactionality, which is fun. And Mike, every time like you're boiling down these topics into like sketches that people can absorb and think about, I've always like fascinated to see what you're sketching and things like that. So
Yeah.
Thank you both for being here and for digging into messy topics like this. Would love to continue this conversation more. And folks who are watching, if you want us to dig into something in particular, or if you have someone in mind that might be an excellent guest for digging into some of these more hairy topics, I think that so that there is. Not to be overcautious, right? Like I tend to be a little bit timid sometimes with things like this, but I think it is important both that we not oversimplify things by assuming our version of reality is correct, right? To Mike's point. But also we shouldn't hold back and basically withhold the power that we do have as people in society who can contribute thought and contribute effort and work to dig into problems. Making maps of problems helps other people see the problems as well. Like they might not even know that certain aspects of these things exist, right? So making a map of something and sharing it with someone else brings them along and helps them understand, and that itself is a useful act as well. So part of what we're thinking about, I think, is how do we come together and work on things together? How do we tap into the power that we already have to understand things better and to even just define what the problems are in some of these messes. So with that, I want to thank you for being here and for watching and spending your time with us. If you want to see future live streams and workshops, you can go to lwm.events. Follow these folks on Twitter, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you all next time. All right, bye everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So Ben, I just realized